thanks Professor Kuspit for agreeing to do this. The basic format is going to be quite simple. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then Professor Kuspit will talk for about 10 minutes. Then we will talk, and then we will have questions. I want to start by talking about some earlier work of mine, and in particular I want to talk about palimpsests. I first became interested in palimpsests when I read about 3rd BC text by Archimedes having been overwritten by a 10th century book of Christian prayers. And when you looked at the pages, you could see both texts at the same time. And this interested me very much, and in a crazy way, it made me think about the stars and the night sky, because when you look at the sky, you're looking at thousands of points of light, all emanating from a different point in time, but your brain can create a moment out of it. The same is true, of course, in this room. The speed of light being constant, the light that reaches me from different points in the room emanates at different times. And so I wanted to make some paintings kind of based on this idea, and my idea was to take some older paintings that were 5, 10 years old and put new paintings on the top and just leave little windows through to see what was underneath. And the idea was there was some kind of mystery about what came before. And I added my letters to sort of create the energy and the movement. And these paintings were very, very abstract. And so what I started to daydream about after that what would happen if I used different images. And so the first one I started thinking about was the Mademoiselle d'Avernon. And in part because when I was 18, I hitchhiked from Minneapolis to New York to look at paintings. And I spent a long time at the MoMA looking at this painting. And so it was sort of a part of me, and it was also, of course, a very important historical painting. And so I started daydreaming about floating my veil of letters over the top of it, creating movement and energy, and taking it out of the moment was my idea. And then that idea really gelled for me when I thought about sort of being in a car driving away from it and looking at it in a rearview mirror. That's when I reversed it. So the image itself is a mirror image of the original. I think of the letters as kind of basic building blocks in a way like to culture or language, in a way like atoms are to the material world, or genes and chromosomes to life itself. So the idea is that there are these kind of basic building blocks that put the paintings into flux, into movement, and sort of try and carry them as potential into the future. The letters in all of these paintings do have a source. They come from Rimbaud's Book of Illuminations, even though you can't read it. But I like that idea because he's referring to illuminated books, which means that the page is painted, so you have a beautiful painted letter like an H or a T or something. And a lot of what I'm doing is, making a painting with letters in it. And he also has this interesting idea of arriving at the unknown by a disordering of the senses. And I don't know exactly what that means, but I do like the idea of trying to understand reality from a different point of view. The other paintings have, the source image appeals to me for different reasons, and the Titian painting in the back is another one It's his Pietà, his very last painting, and he intended it to go above his tomb. And it's a very, when I was in my 20s, again, I spent a long time looking at the painting, so I have a personal connection to it. But it's also a very spiritual and a very beautiful painting of light, but it's also a very religious painting. And so I thought, in the context of the history of painting, there's a lot of the roots of oil painting like I do is in the spiritual and religious, and I thought just leaving little bits of that showing through under the surface would make an interesting painting. And of course, in our culture, I think it's not just oil painting that has an underpinning of a religious history just beneath the surface of things. There's a painting downstairs of American Nazis, and so I think a little bit about how things come and go in history. Like, why is one idea relevant now and another idea disappear and another come back? And the American Nazi image was reprinted from a 1962 press photo of American Nazi Party in the Washington Post after Charlottesville. And so my thinking was, well, why does this image come back? Why does this come back now in a way to kind of haunt us? And then a painting like the clock, I know that the base 60 counting system that clocks are made from come from ancient Babylon, and they must somehow measure time better than our base 10 system. So you have something that's stayed in history for a very long time. But when you look out into a room and you see a watch or something, you don't necessarily think ancient Babylon. Just something about leaving the edges green, and the green edges, well, the green is a little bit like the color of my eyes. Not that that matters very much, but the reason for leaving the edges is that I thought by not letting the image go to the edge, I would keep them in the present moment, like keep them from being a window onto another world or another reality. And then the idea is that the letters come into play and put them back into motion and kind of reanimate them and sort of move us into the future. So the basic idea I'm trying to work with is, expressing the ever-changing universe and the constant kind of flux of life.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm an art historian. I'm going to speak art historically, a few comments. This is a very multi-dimensional art, many kinds of meanings, and I'll try to get at some of them. First of all, and this is in no particular order of primacy here, these works, Doug is an appropriation artist. He's taking works from elsewhere, he's reproducing them, they go through certain changes in the reproduction. It's not dissimilar to, say, what Sherry Levine did with Duchamp, okay? So there's that appropriation artist as well. Then, tucked into that appropriation artist is a conceptual artist. We've had all kinds of ideas here. The work has a conceptual meaning, the whole underlay, overlay, however you want to use it, the superstructure, maybe an understructure, or the substructure of conceptual meaning. Something about Rimbaud, lettre de voyant, he wanted to become letter seer, and he associated letters with different colors, as you may recall as well. Interesting also about Rimbaud, he gave up making art, that is poetry. The revelations came from drugs. He was a druggie for a certain amount of time. He gave up drugs, so he wanted to disorder his senses, disordered conscious, achieve a so-called altered state of consciousness, as it's called. Okay. He became a gun runner. He died from syphilis. He lost a leg. He died at a fairly young age. He was a rebel with an art cause, okay? which he did not consummate because he stopped making art, that is, writing poetry. Became a very important figure and model for the Surrealists, influenced, it's believed, Lautréamont, who was more or less contemporary with him, hard to say. But it's in this vein of, what shall we call it, proto-symbolism that this work can be located as well. Now, another take I have on this work, which is maybe peculiar to me, there's an interesting dialectic going in here. What I see is these letters are bombarding these works. The letters are here, and these things are coming like bullets being shot at it. It's like this guy's in a shooting gallery, and he's shooting these letters, these little bullet letters, and they're bombarding this stuff. What do they do to it? Well, first of all, they take these, quote, dead paintings, dead old masters, old masterpieces, however transformed, Picasso, etc., and give them a little illumination, just to bring light in there. It adds kind of excitement to them. There's almost I hesitate to say this, but I'll use kind of art perceptual complexity that's introduced here, dynamic. Interesting, looking at the letters, and as far as I can see, the ones that I see here, like the A, they're in perspective, they cut. You see that A has an edge going right into there, the O also, the E cuts. So these are cutting letters, they're cutting letters. And it's not exactly a palimpsest, which is writing over something and you don't know the other text, really. This is my interpretation of it. But what it is you've got a text there and you are attacking it. So I see this in some way as, quote, anti-art, anti-aesthetic, okay, within that context. At the same time, the white bullets, whatever is bombarded, some of them are quite elegant, they can stand by themselves, they're very abstract, adds a kind of filigree, an interesting filigree, adds sensation, okay? So think of Cézanne's idea of painting his sensations. In some way, each of them becomes like a pellet of sensation, bombarding the old sensation embodied in these works, in the Snyder, in the Mondrian. Okay, so here you have this fresh new sensation, Mr. Baudelaire's sensation of the new coming in through these rather strange, eccentric, odd kind of pellets, which destroy at the same time as they enliven. Okay, it's a very interesting dialectic. I respect it enormously. And sometimes the letters in some of the work over there get so, this over here, they seem to overwhelm the work. They seem to overwhelm the work. It's almost, that is the work that's underneath here. Here you can see Snyder, however transformed, and I've read the text and so forth, but they overwhelm it. So what I see in you, if I may say so, is a kind of conflict, as well as a dialectic, and dialectic is a conflict, thesis, antithesis, with a unresolved synthesis, okay? Conflict between the image that you've got there, or you've transformed it already, appropriately transformed it, and the letters that you're bombarding it, which are your letters, your words, you, symbolize you. They are you. They are your gestures. They are a kind of gesture. They function that way. So I admire the complexity of this work. It's quite unique, and I like the multi-level dimension, the multi-level meaning of it. What I also see, if I may say so, it's what I call endgame modernism. People may not like that idea, but there has been a fair amount of discourse by various writers, including myself, that modernism has had its day, so to say. Modernism has become old-fashioned, decadent. I'm hardly the only person that says this. There have been various European writers, etc. I call it endgame modernism. It's still around. It's an inertial system. It keeps on going and going. The Museum Modern Art reeks of it. It just keeps going on and on and on. So the question is, how do you accommodate to this modernism, or if you want, what Harold Rosenberg called the style of the new. So another dimension of meaning, which is very important to me, and which I think is, quote, to use that overworked word, postmodern. One of the things said about postmodern is you have the tradition of the old, or what Baudelaire called the tradition of the Grand Masters. He said it was in decline in 1846, and then the tradition of the new was being born. Rosenberg said it was born. All of its ideas were in Paris, pre-1914, that stretched between 1907 and 14. Rosenberg gives it principle, and he said the rest of it was just spelling out the possibilities of it. So here you have this, shall we call it seasoned modernism, this old seasoned modernism that's still going, still has possibilities. The idea of postmodernism, which was presented by myself, various other people, Julie Christie, was that integrate the old and new. How do you get the old and new together? So I see, going into galleries, looking around me, here, wherever, I see artists looking at old masters, and these are old modern masters, okay? They're looking at old masters, okay, but they're bringing in something modern, new, and new ideas. I remember seeing an exhibition in Chelsea a number of years ago. A female artist took Rubens' images of females, you know, nice bosomy females and all of that stuff, and she put male arms around them, you know, like male, what do they call, Me Too or something, that kind of thing. So Rubens was essentially molesting or making improper approaches to these women. So that's the issue that I see being addressed here. How do you accommodate or relate or bring together the old and the new? And what is interesting also to me, both are unstable now. That's what endgame means. And unstable, they're unstable. There's no firm ground. And when I look at these works, just looking from that point of view, art used to have a ground, okay? In a sense, it served something other than itself. As we all know, it served religion for a long time, it then served the state for a long time, and then it served the self, self-expression. All Kandinsky, internal necessity, feeling is all, okay, that's all gone. So what's left? Okay, then we have art for the sake of art. Okay, art for the sake of art is vacuous. Okay, it doesn't do anything. So what I see is an effort to take, let's use another clumsy metaphor. You know how you make a fire with 2 pieces of wood in there? So I see he's taking 2 old pieces of wood, old modernism and new modernism and old master, and rubbing them together, and I do think he generates a fire. You know, I think there's this kind of fire there. I don't know if it's a big fire, but it's a fire. It has energy, and those are particles of energy, is another way of looking at it. And I remind you that Pollock was called energism, a movement of his quote, energy. When Mondrian endorsed Pollock through Peggy Guggenheim, and she couldn't figure out why, and he said it has energy. And of course, Americans are supposed to have energy. You know, I'm not sure we have anything else these days, but we have energy. And what I see here, this is energy. This is energism. So I admire this work for what, from my art historical perspective, is a sort of rather amazing integration of all kinds of ideas that have been very relevant for, I would say, the last 150 years. Okay. I find it very interesting also, last thing I'll say, that you go back to Rimbaud and to palimpsest, and one of the things that the palimpsests did do, and we know this for a fact, is a lot of classical manuscripts were preserved under Christian texts and recovered. That's the way we have, for example, the plays of Sophocles. They were all kept by monks who were serious scholars, and then some of them were hidden, but also they used the paper, because the paper was very precious, so you had to work it over. So you get a process of erasure and preservation at the same time. Some of these works, the images, or the source image, seems more erased than in others. Over there, for example, seems more. In others, it comes through quite terrifically. And one last thing, certain things I really like for just what they do with color. That piece there, the gray piece over there, and then the Mondrian there. I think they're quite special. I happen to like this also, but I like it when the image becomes a little more obscure. You know. And then I would say that is more, quote, abstract. And then I'm very interested that you went to this work as well. This is, of course, one of the premier works of modernism. And here you are, you know, covering it over, blasting it to hell, you know, going over it, you know, this work. And I think that's marvelous. It's been too much attention paid to it, really. Thank you. Contradict me, say I don't know what I'm talking about. I really don't.
No, I like what you have to say. None of these images are reproduced mechanically, so whatever part of appropriation is in them is done by the eye, which is actually fairly difficult. And when I did them, I never thought about appropriation. creation. It never occurred to me. I did think of them as kind of a point in time in order for me to set the whole thing into motion.
Right. It does that also. But you are taking images that are known.
Yeah, they have to be, because otherwise, how can they be like a bookmark or something? How can they be a mile marker of some kind if they're not known? That's why the earlier ones where I was dealing with my own abstract images couldn't pull the same thing off, because who knows my earlier images except maybe me.
But you are interested in image.
Yeah.
You want the image to come through in some way.
Yeah, the first piece I did like this is one that I showed in Venice, and it was also the Titian Pietà, because I often come back to that painting, but I covered it up so much that you really couldn't see it at all. And so with these, I wanted to step back a little bit and depending on what I was trying to do, show more or less of the image.
Say something about your choice of images. Why the Pietà, religious image? This is another sacred image in a way.
Yeah.
Modernism, sort of sacred image.
Well,
You're choosing sacred artists, sacred modern artists in many ways.
well, in both of these cases, it's, you know, I saw these images without really knowing anything about them, and I had an amazing kind of personal experience with them, which is why I think they were sort of a part of me. And then, you know, when I started to think of images to use, I also know that they're important images in the history of art. So they have both meanings to me. And all the images had something like that, you know, some kind of relation to it. You know, I wanted to do one that dealt with death a little bit, and I've always loved those still lifes that do that. And when I thought of doing this one, I just didn't know if I could do it, which was a reason for me to try, because I've never done anything like that. It's quite a bit bigger than the original, which in some ways makes it a little harder.
I've read your text, and I like very much your talk about flux. And it very much reminded me of the theory of creative flux by philosopher Alfred Whitehead. He argued that with one of the basic concepts in his revision, so-called process theory. Process philosophy, as it's also called. And I think part of what you're trying to do, if I may say so, and I don't know if I might or not, but all of these letters are in flux. Language is in flux. You talk about that, how in a few, maybe 100 years, even less, our English will not be recognized, just as Shakespeare's English has to be translated for us today. I mean, it's a different English than we speak. And I'm just wondering if you're talking in some way about, quote, the flux of art, the flux of images. I wonder if in some way there's some oblique relation to what Malraux called the museum without walls, which he brought in relation to photography. He argued that in the future we will have this endless museum through photography and place it all around.
Instagram.
That's right, Instagram. And I wonder if what you're doing is in some way not the challenge to the facile way images are created today. You know, you just click your camera, whatever. And this is, so to say, unfacile. This is not facile imagery. You're making it sort of hard for yourself.
Yeah.
You know, it's very easy to get a really terrific image today. You know, I know photographers who, in their struggle to resist iPhone images, are using old cameras with long exposures. Okay, wanting a different sense of light, a different tone, shall we say, a different temporal tone, as well as a spatial tone. And I wonder if in some way you aren't struggling with that. One might say also, these are old works. I mean, the Demoiselles is an old work, excuse me. But Snyder's is an even older work than that. And in a way, you're refreshing them. You're putting some dew of language, D-E-W, dew of language on this, and it refreshes them, but it's old. And I just wonder, I propose this to you, why don't you forget the old master images, these masterpieces, which in some way are so, and just do all this flickering? flickering. It's a thought. Go.
Yeah, in these pieces, I wanted that sense of time and history, but it doesn't mean that that's what I'm going to keep doing. Some of the works previous to this were a little bit more like what you're talking about, but then I couldn't get the sense of time that I wanted, or the sense of history, which is what I was thinking more about.
You do have a sense of history here. It's a sort of faded history. It's an oddly meaningless history, except for people in art, really. You know, these are all famous artworks, and people may look at that and say, oh, you know, Snyder did a great job painting all that still life stuff. But basically, these are trophies of art history. Okay.
Assuming that they weren't about something else in the beginning.
Yeah. Well, they were about
which are things like birth, death, sex, politics, and religion, that sort of thing, which are interesting themes to still try and deal with, but hard to keep.
So you're interested in the existential verities. And all these artists, I mean, this work is about decay and death.
Absolutely.
Okay. All of these works have some allegorical influence.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're trying to recover that sense by different means.
Absolutely.
Okay. May I just ask you a sort of clumsy question? Would you say you have, quote, a religious sensibility? Were you brought up in any of that, if I say artists?
No, actually the opposite. But my education in painting has been traveling and looking at them. And if you travel and look at paintings, you go to lots of religious and spiritual places to see them. So a lot of the work I've seen hasn't been in museums, it's been in churches or other places like that. And you get a sense of that. I mean, Titian's Pietà was meant to go over his tomb, and it's his last painting. And he's in it, kneeling in the corner. So to him it was a very religious, very spiritual piece, and the painting itself has that feeling.
So you identify with him in some way?
I didn't use any images that I didn't identify with the work itself. That was the reason for picking it.
How do you identify with Picasso?
Well, what I was saying, it doesn't have to necessarily to do with the history of art. So when I was 18, I hitchhiked in New York. I hadn't seen any paintings, or hardly any, and I went to the MoMA, and for some reason this painting spoke to me, and I looked at it for a very, very long time, and it just sort of became enmeshed in me.
So the Titian is about death, okay, himself. You know what the Picasso is about? Going to a whorehouse where he got gonorrhea. Originally in the work, where there is now the floral arrangement, there was a skull, there was a figure with a skull holding it out. We know he definitely had gonorrhea. He went for treatment, and this was his negation of these whores that he saw in Demoiselles d'Avignon. Avignon is a street in Barcelona. It's all very upscale now. That's what happens to places where houses of prostitutes are. The houses go for a lot of money later on. They have sort of credit to them. So, I mean, does this seem about something to do with sexual experience for you?
Well, it did on some level, but also the experience of just looking at how it was fragmented and painted, and you know, one color dry over another, one face put on over another, that kind of fragmentation of the image, which, you know, I had never really seen before.
Well, what's interesting is when you talk about the Titian, you bring in death. When you talk about this, you talk about it in purely formal terms. There's a contradiction.
Well,
I see you defending yourself against the meaning of this.
No, not necessarily. And I also know that, you know, it laid on his studio floor for 30 years before anything happened to it. And one of the reasons that he managed, the dealer managed to sell it, is that against Picasso's wishes, the title got changed from, Picasso wanted to call it something whorehouse, and then his new dealer changed it to Mademoiselle d'Avignon, which he insisted would help sell it, and apparently it did.
I just want to say the Demoiselle d'Avignon title was given by a poet friend of his, André Salomon. Okay, there was a whole sort of circle of Picasso around there, and then it was picked up. But Picasso didn't want it to leave, partly, I'm not contradicting you, because I think the dealer had a word in it, because it spoke to something about his experience. And remember, he famously said all his art was autobiographical. some way a encoding of his experience, and this is another example. And everybody looks at the African stuff, okay, which is, I think, very important, but that African stuff reminds us that Picasso began his career as a caricaturist, okay, and a lot of his work has been understood as caricature. Interest in the grotesque, which you see particularly in the works done in the 20s, these sort of surreal cubist type works, which were done, so much of his work is done in relation to a woman. So he was married to Olga, you may remember, and then he began to have an affair here, there, and wherever, and he wouldn't, Olga wanted a divorce, he wouldn't divorce her because he was a Catholic. Okay, so this is all on record. Olga stalked him. She'd come around following him on the beach, you know, and so forth, and they're all Olga. Okay, so this is about women. Picasso's woman problem. All you have to do is read Life with Picasso to get the point of this. When I'm saying there's an autobiographical dimension, what I'm trying to do is probe you autobiographically, which maybe I shouldn't do, but this is important work, and always the artist's self, the artist's personal history is always involved in significant art. I don't think you can make significant art without somehow coming out of your own life world, your own emotional history. That's what I'm saying. So I'm sort of maybe provocatively trying to ask.
Well, no, I mean, when I first looked at the piece, I wasn't aware of the whorehouse history. I was looking at it in a different way.
Right.
But maybe one of the reasons I reversed it and thought about looking at it in the rearview mirror is because of that idea.
But you knew these were women.
Yeah. But I didn't know. When I was 18, I didn't know anything about Picasso. But I still had a good
something
experience
about
with
women.
That might be debatable.
Should we open it up?
Sure.
Questions?
And your choice of poetry, was there specific lines that you used or discarded? I mean,
No,
the words of one poet, that kind of selection process, like which letter, which word, which line, that intuition becomes important too.
Yeah, except I know that you can't read them, and I know that I can't read them, so they become kind of a box filled with individual letters, and so then I start selecting them based on size and movement and what, almost like putting on a brush stroke. So once all of these are made from stencils, individual stencils, and they all get distorted in space individually, and they all get painted one at a time.
But you picked that poet.
But I picked that poet. In a way, it's meaningless, but in a way, it's meaningful. I mean, there's no way you could know.
I know that, but I'm trying to get a little bit.
I don't think about a specific line for a specific poem. Once I decided on using that, all the letters kind of got all mixed together. It was more of thinking about the interplay between the letters, which don't necessarily belong, and the image and how that played out. It was more important than thinking about an individual line or anything like that.
But you chose Rimbaud. That's a very significant choice.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't choose Baudelaire, you didn't choose St. John Peirce. I mean, you chose the seminal modern poet, key modern poet. In a way, you were going back to the beginning of modernism, in some sense, and then going your own way with it. I understand that one works on these things on many levels, but I agree that the choice that you make, that you've brought this out here in this discussion, made this public, indicates the significance for you. And I think you're working with some kind of unconscious motivation, if I may use that overworked term, there, and that interests me. Okay, because I agree with Clement Greenberg, who famously said, you know, the literal order of effects, as he called it, of work of art matters, but there's also what he called an unconscious, preconscious order of effects. And where he and I disagreed, and I knew him fairly well, one of my books was about him, was I think you can spell them out. He said you can't touch them. But I said they make the work live. They give it its vitality. They give it what he calls plenitude of presence. So I see a certain plenitude of presence in your work, but coming for a different reason than he would see it, but just color and line. It's more than just color and line. You're a literary artist in some way also, right?
That's good. So, talk a little bit about that in terms of your evolution. Is it evolution or is it trying different things, experimenting? So you're not your earliest, but your earlier works. The language is much more structural. I think it's sort of, you've turned the literature into visual. There isn't the background.
Right.
We see structure and letters. And there are some pieces where there are readable words in the pieces.
Yeah.
So, you know, this is a great discussion, but it feels like a moment in time, this particular experiment. It's not the whole story of what you've done with letters and art.
Well, I feel like because one of the things I've always thought about working with is the flux and how things change, that if I don't keep changing myself, then it doesn't make any sense. So yeah, a lot of the earlier works are just the letters, and they create different kinds of patterns. Sometimes it feels like a waterfall or the universe or water, something that can go to infinity in some way.
Pieces like that.
Yeah.
And some have words in them. Some of them actually.
Some have words in them. Yeah. Well, this piece here has words in it. It's just not that one, but the one in the next. It's hard to see, but it says boy, girl, man, woman. It's all the genders, and they're in transparent white. They just go over the top of each other until they make one kind of solid image. But because they're words, they create a different motion, because the words are art.
Yes. Okay.
Why did you do this in color? The lines of color here are so all white.
Well, it's just based on me imagining what the interplay is going to be like between the letters and the image, and so I adjust them per the image. Most of the letters on over the top all have some color in them in general. There isn't generally any just white. But I'm thinking about what the image is and trying to make them work together.
Can you speak to the artistic journey from really raising the rice man with chicken and moving forward the letters and this whole where you are today?
Well, the one thing that's always been constant is I'm always trying to push the picture out to the edge or past the edge, even though with these, you know, I didn't want them to be about the illusion, but it's always about pushing out to infinity in some way, going back to the very first paintings.
Any more questions? Comments?
What's do you think letters is I hate to use the word, but a device, a technique that will be with you for a long time, forever?
I don't know the answer to that. I feel like in a way, they, like he was saying, that they become me. They have the same sort of quirky attitude I have about life.
Just, if I could do one last, just to think about the work, and you were talking about the relationship between this kind of veil of letters and scrim of letters, which you see as kind of penetrating or attacking the ground, which one could read as a history of art. So there's clearly something about abstraction and figuration, which is very, very clear in this. And we're talking about literary quotation, but clearly these are visual quotations.
Right.
But in the quotations, in the way you choose to reproduce, you change scale, you change brushwork, it's completely different. So it signifies the field of painting, but it's not a duplicate of that painting.
Oh no, in no way. And I only worked with images off the internet, knowing that there would be some inaccuracies involved with whatever picture I found.
But it has that kind of very similar to like set painting, right? Set painting, the closer you get to it, you realize it's just meant to represent something from a distance. So this represents an old master. This represents a time in modernism. So how do you think about the use of quotes? Because clearly they're both you, right? Both the abstraction and because you appropriate in a very specific way, the visual imagery is you as well. So it's not referred to as a dialectic, which is very, very good, because it's not one or the other. And how do you think about that in your work? Because the tells the story about your life is the same question, going from the chickens, which are all figure, to the abstraction of the work that you see at the World Trade Center, but these are all you.
Yeah. What was that?
The question was, how do you see those cohabiting, or what do you see as either the tension, and maybe this is back to the question about your own sense of where this work comes from or where it might be going?
Yeah, I'm not sure where it's going. I mean, with these images, I wanted something that I had a personal relationship with, something I had seen that I had a personal relationship with somehow. And then they had to be images that, even if you don't know art history, you have a sense comes from a certain moment in time, because I wanted to deal with trying to put them into flux and give them movement and that sort of thing. But there's a personal experience behind each image that I picked that's underneath, not just an art historical reason.
Okay, go ahead.
You know, when I first saw these, I was really intrigued with this framing device that you used. I don't remember that word before. And maybe talk a little bit more about it, but it's interesting, it's uneven. It's interesting the letters wrap around the edges, and there's a sense that it's a picture within a picture. You're saying it's an appropriation, and it defies using a formal frame. I mean, you almost can't. You've created your own frame.
Well, maybe in my mind, I didn't want them to really be about appropriation. So if this painting goes to the edge and it's folded at the edge, then it becomes about the illusion of the space. And so I wanted it to be kind of in the current moment. And I felt that by and I didn't want it to be just kind of even. I wanted it to be sort of like it landed on the picture.
So how would you feel if a collector buys it and frames it? I'm a collector.
No, I don't think these need to be framed.
No, I know you don't.
That's what I would say.
Please don't do it.
What's interesting is it looks like a piece of cloth, canvas. You see the edges torn over there. So put on top of this canvas. So in a sense, you're saying maybe it can be rolled up. It's a sort of relic.
It's a relic. And one of the great puns in English language is the pun between text and textile. They come from the same root word, and text is a kind of weaving of words, and textile is a weaving of thread. So there's a kind of play between them.
I think as a contemporary artist, you're dealing with, I think, what is a huge problem for a serious artist. You've got all this abundance of visual information, all these works from Titian to Mondrian, span centuries here. And how does one deal with this? You have this tremendous history before you. There's no such thing as a fresh start anymore. I mean, what does a fresh start mean exactly? You know? Maybe Pollock was trying to do a fresh start, but some way you could see him as the end of something, collapsing with the old image.
But I've seen all his old drawings of Mannerist painters.
Yes, I have also. So you're a Mannerist, you're a modern Mannerist. Does that make some sense perfectly?
I admire Tintoretto and Pollock both almost equally in some of their paintings. So, but the experience of their paintings.
But in some way, you're struggling with all this abundance of material and you're personalizing it. And again, we return to the subjective, your subjectivity, in whatever way you express it, you feel this, or it's your first sight, or whatever, makes these works in the end finally significant or adds to their significance. It's a subjective gamut to put all these letters in, okay? So in a way, you are sort of hanging on to modernist subjectivity, but with a difference. If you think of Kandinsky's idea of internal necessity, I don't quite see internal necessity as directly there, as what he said. And he famously said, I want people to see what's behind my art, which he meant in it, but I'm not sure that there's anything exactly behind this art. One has to read that subjectivity in from your handling of the gestures, as I see them, these letters, quirky letters, and your sort of quirky way of redoing these works and so forth. So those are all traces of some kind of subjective experience of the work that's sort of filtering through in a very indeterminate way, you know, and that's very interesting. I find it very daring that you take on all these artists with their, so to say, very strong established reputations, places in art history, and I wonder if some of the implications of your work is what's been said by Bolding, I believe Bolding is in German, that there's no way of doing a history of modern art anymore, of art anymore. It is too complex, and I would say absurdly complex, to write a history. So in a way, you might be, I'm just speculating here, you might be talking about the collapse of the history of art. You can put a Snyder next to a Mondrian or whatever you want, a futurist, and then, you know, fiddle around with them, so to say. I'm just wondering if you aren't sort of fiddling while Rome is burning, in some sense. You know, because there is
No,
some...
but I am taking sides in a way, because these are pieces that I want to have people to have a personal sort of aesthetic experience with. And there is another side of people who don't want that, so I am kind of taking sides in that.
You used the word aesthetic for the first time, so tell me what your idea of the aesthetic is.
Well, for me, it's in the paintings, the sort of emotional sort of transference of my ideas to the canvas, and then people get that tenderness or maybe bullets coming back at them from the piece itself. You know, one of the reasons a lot of these pieces appealed to me in the beginning was because of the way they were made, because of the aesthetic experience I had with them. So it's not just fiddling, it's things that I feel a strong attachment to that I'm, you know, bringing into my own.
And that comes through the handle, through your sort of pulses that you put on it.
May I ask how you tell if you said it was like palettes and rollets, the letters coming at it, did that resonate or was that no?
Well, no, some of them, they certainly have that. I mean, the idea for me, and it's a metaphor, of course, is that these letters are in a way a potential to drive into the future. They're like a building block, you know, a basic. And they have the ability to move things forward. And so that's a perfectly good way to think about it. I mean, the pieces are all to me different.
So when you talk about letters, I noticed a couple of the paintings, the Langston Hughes and other rooms.
The Langston Hughes is the one exception, by the way, of the text.
Yeah.
The text comes
But
from.
there are a couple of subtexts, and you look at this one here where it says Emerson and Langston Hughes, and there are scribbles, in other words, that are not these letters.
Right.
Why those, and what is the meaning?
Well, I was reading Emerson when I was working on this, and Emerson, in the essay I was reading, was talking about how you had to give up on the classics and create the new classics, and it was sort of a call to arms, and apparently people picked it up, like Herman Melville and Walt Whitman, and, you know, didn't try and redo Ulysses, but did their own classics. So that idea, I think Blake said, you drive your car over the bones of the dead. So those kind of things, I think, always coexist somehow, because, of course, Emerson was influenced a lot by other people who came before him.
So you're driving your car over these dead artists? Is that what this? Those the marks of your wheels?
I think it's always a part of what you do, on some level.
We can take one last question.
Well, if you don't have one, I'll have one last question. There's at least one painting where the image is an outlier. You chose downstairs in the beautiful painting with the girl in the dress, a painting by an unknown artist. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, the artist, they think they might know the name of the artist, and I'm forgetting it. It's an early American painting. I think it hangs in the National Gallery.
Probably not
And-
really known who did it.
Yeah, and I've always liked those paintings. And, this painting is called Tea Party. And so it's an early American tea party painting, and of course tea party at that time had a certain meaning. And the meaning has changed. So my kind of love of those anonymous portraits and the kind of clumsiness but yet beautifully handled paint, and then kind of the early American history to it, combined with the change of meaning of Tea Party.
Everybody, thank you very much for joining us today. And this is great. And Donald, thanks for joining us.
Good to see you.